Hello, and welcome back to Coffee Break, everybody. My name is Faith Jacobs, and April is Autism Acceptance Awareness Month. And for today's episode, I'm going to dive into a topic that I think is very important and one that deserves to be talked about because incredible things have been set in motion by amazing creators recently in the last year and a half. And I think it needs to be talked about more. I really think it needs to be talked about specifically what's been happening in the world of representation as far as books and television go. So, let's begin with what autism representation is not and where it shouldn't come from. Number one, there are many shows out there. And there have been since Rain Man came into existence. And look, maybe some people, that's their reality. But I think it becomes problematic when that's the only story that you see told. And you, as an autistic individual, who doesn't fall into that same level, then you're passed over because, as we all know, media influences the culture and vice versa. And culture influences media. So you have a decade of, and let's talk about this first before we dive into what's been amazing in this point in time. You have a decade of representation out there, if you can call it that didn't represent anybody. It maybe represented a small portion of the population, which is like 1 in 5, according to the statistics that I looked up one time. But you don't necessarily have media out there representing a wide range of stories and a wide range of individuals. And even as far back as, I think the closest thing that I ever saw to a character who I really liked, and I kind of, didn't maybe saw myself in it before I even knew that I was, and I'm not ashamed to say it, I'm autistic. I'm on the spectrum. I'm neurodivergent. That's, it's part of me. It's part of my identity. I haven't shied away from that. And this podcast has, discussed the topic of neurodivergency and neurodiversity, often, and I've not shied away from my story with it and my thoughts and my feelings. But you have this whole decade of representation that really didn't represent anybody. And like I was saying, the closest I feel like we got to maybe a little bit was in an often forgotten piece of media from the 2000s called Alphas. Now, granted, the character who played Gary from Alphas was neurotypical, but then again, so was Claire Danes, and she portrayed the most intense material in a biopic about Temple Grandin's life, a very well-known autistic woman who an incredible woman who I admire. Claire Danes did an amazing job in that role. I do think that maybe if it's more intense, maybe in certain circumstance, This is going to be your faith, your mocha might be a little hot kind of comment. But maybe if the material is too intense for those in the spectrum, and I feel as if I've heard those in the spectrum say the same thing. Maybe, just maybe, there is a little bit of wiggle room. Maybe. But I think it depends on really the intensity and the severity of the subject matter and what you're trying to tell. For example, there is a very specific autistic movie that we do not talk about. And I feel so gross even bringing it up. But the point is, the actor who played Gary in Alphas was not autistic, but he did a lot of research. And the important thing was that he didn't try to imitate. And he didn't try to copy. He just did his own research, and he built Gary as if Gary were a real person who just happened to be on the spectrum. And I think because he did it that way, and I read like an article or interview where he talked about that. He talked about doing research, and he talked about listening to other stories, and he did so with all the intents and purposes of understanding what his material, and I think he's someone who does that thoroughly and very well. And he's regarded by most autistic individuals in the autism community, at the time at least, as one of the best things, as one of the best portrayals out there. And I would agree at the time, because at the time there was hardly anything, and I mean, think about it, 2008. We didn't have all the things that we now have, and I'm going to get to that, because I'm going to get to the main topic, but this little ramble here at the start is kind of important for context in some degree, because up until that point, there really wasn't anything. I mean, if there was, we were coming off the era where Rain Man was the peak, of quote-unquote autistic savant representation. And then you had I Am Sam, and I'll count Flowers for Algernon, and What's Eating Gilbert Grape, in that I know that they're more about those who are mentally challenged, is the correct phrasing. Those who are much slower in their learning and different. I'll count them as part of the what I'm going to title as the early 2000s, the late 90s, the early 2000s neurotypical portrayal of disability renaissance. We'll call it that. We'll call it the disability, film renaissance. And often in these films, and I've discussed this heavily with other people, these characters, were often, Flowers for Algernon. Although I love Flowers for Algernon. That movie and that book, I'm listening to it right now, breaks my heart. I love it. I think it's a true, and I think it's heart-wrenching. I think it will get its own podcast episode. Like, that's how much I love it. But you had these movies out there that either they didn't treat their disabled protagonists like they were people, like Flowers for Algernon talks about. Well, what a movie to have during the era when there was hardly any disability representation. You basically made a movie that goes over the entire subject matter of the world and the people, of that era, not treating those with disabilities as people, which is exactly what all the Hollywood movies of that era did. They weren't people. They were objects, basically, being pushed around by plots where they had no autonomy. And there are lots and lots of films out there from that era like that. So you know, if you were a parent in the early 2000s and you saw those kinds of things coming out, heavens to Betsy, I'm sure you were terrified, and not to mention the almighty autism squeaks is what I'm going to call them, because they're just an awful organization that you should not be supporting. Please, heavens to Betsy, don't support Autism Speaks. And you had them who thought they were doing all high and mighty work and, spreading the joys of autism will ruin your marriage, bull hockey. If you were a parent in the early 2000s and you saw that, and then I imagine, sure, you were probably terrified, and I am so sorry. But, so it wasn't really a great time. The whole point to that very, very long ramble is the fact that the early 2000s and their attempt to create autistic characters and their attempt to create, disability representation for those who were disabled wasn't great. It sucked. And, and I've watched those movies, and I won't lie, Rain Man left me with a bad taste in my mouth. I didn't mind I Am Sam. I thought that was fine. I've not seen What's Eating Gilbert Grape. I've watched, most of the what little there was back then. I've seen it. I acknowledge it for what it is, and some of it I put in a corner and go, never touching you again. Because I don't want to watch that movie again, and wouldn't want to, even for the purposes of review, I just can't. I just find some of them offensive. But that leads me into the current standings, the now. About 2018. There were a couple of series that were out on television. I remember that when The Good Doctor came to TV. I don't remember the year, but I do remember that when it came to television. The character of The Good Doctor was said to be autistic. Played, once again, by a neurotypical individual. I love Freddie Highmore. Don't get me wrong. I don't think he did anything necessarily wrong for the time. Let's make that clear. For the time in which he was cast and that show came on the air, he didn't do anything wrong. I know that there are so many autistics out there who get, and I don't usually curse on my podcast, I try not to, but I know they get pissy. They get pissy about that. And yes, you have a right to be, because there are so many, and I know so many amazing autistic actors and actresses out there who probably easily could have been in that role. But let's remember the time in which it was being made. Diversity and neurodiversity, while it's been around since the 90s, neurodiversity as a movement has been around since 1998. If I'm not mistaken in my dates, and if I am, I'll go back and I'll correct myself. But, the neurodiversity movement, which really kind of began with those who were on the spectrum, and to try and shift the conversation around autism has been around for a very, 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 very long time. It feels. It's been around for a long time. And the fact of the matter is, so at the time, I imagine it would be controversial maybe now if The Good Doctor were made with the current way of things. And I agree with this. I do not think that they would probably try to find more authentic casting. But the character, I think his name is Sean, if I'm not mistaken. The Good Doctor's the character's name is Sean. I think Sean sort of falls into that Rain Man-esque stereotype, which is a stereotype for a reason. Thank you, Rain Man. It sort of falls into the savant category. And like I said, statistically speaking, to find somebody who is a savant in that way is a 1 in 5 chance. It's not as common as people are led to believe. As a matter of fact, it's rare among autistic individuals. It's very rare. How do I explain this? Not every autistic individual who you meet is a genius. We have areas in which we thrive, but we're not geniuses. We're not next level. Like it is said that Einstein and Mozart were supposedly autistic. If you look at them and the way that they were, and there's historical evidence that these people who changed the fabric of our reality and our world, both musically and scientifically, were said to be autistic, which is amazing if you think about it. But not every person is an Einstein. Not every person is a Mozart. Not every person who is autistic, fits into the genius category. I am intelligent. Just because I'm not genius level, savant level intelligence doesn't mean that I, as an autistic individual, am not intelligent. I 100% am. I am just intelligent in very specific areas of passion and interest, what we would call a special interest. That's the terminology. Just me and those that I know, we're incredibly smart. My friends and my colleagues who I know who fall onto the same kind of spectrum as me are incredibly smart people. They're amazingly intelligent, and they're talented, and they're creative, and I love them. And every single person who I've met throughout my life who was autistic, from the time that I could remember meeting someone who had at the time the now controversial, labeling of Asperger's syndrome. It's amazing what research can tell you. And I'm not even going to dive into that. That would be its own topic. Trust me. But, from the time that I met somebody who at the time, due to labeling and the era, had the label of Asperger's syndrome, every single one of them was intelligent and kind and creative and fun in their own way. Most of them weren't savant-level geniuses, but it didn't mean that they were stupid. And I'm not stupid. So that's my problem. That's my problem, I think, with some of the former representation, was the fact that it's not that it's... When I say stereotype, people sit there and think of an autistic character sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth, or flapping their hands. No. When I say stereotype, I mean telling one kind of story. And that is of the autistic savant, which most autistics don't even fit into categorically. They just don't. And that was the problem. The problem with representation from the 90s to somewhere in the mid-2000s was the fact that that's all that they were telling. You didn't have characters like Gary from Alphas. I think his name is Gary Bell. You didn't have characters like Gary Bell. You hardly had disabled characters at all. Unless it was about the severity of what they were dealing with and how people treated them badly, or if they were written up to be comedic and funny, but not in a way that was just how they are authentically, but comedic in a very derogatory way, and that was my problem. And so fast forward to 2019, and for the first time in my young life, I witness another autistic show. 2. As a matter of fact, I take that back. There are 2 autistic shows that come out around this time. Atypical on Netflix, and Everything's Gonna Be Okay. Everything's Gonna Be Okay may not, I don't know, maybe it was airing? I feel like it was airing in 2019. I really gotta check my dates, and I will. I promise you. But like, Atypical and Everything's Gonna Be Okay. I have strong feelings about one, and joyful feelings about at least the first season for Everything's Gonna Be Okay. Because I heard that, at least this is what I read from other people, that by seasons 2, I think, of Everything's Gonna Be Okay, seasons 2 and 3, like, they started to implement things that really made the show, like, go on, like, a downward spiral, which sucked. But at least as far as the first season was concerned, I really liked Matilda. I really loved the character of Matilda. She was so wonderful, and for Everything's Gonna Be Okay, which is sort of like a dark comedy kind of show about a family. They lose their dad, I think, to cancer or something. Like he passes away, and it's this older brother who's kind of left to deal with his 2 sisters, who are both played, I think, by one of them is played by a set of autistic twins, and Lillian Carrier, I think her name is, and then the other is played by Caitlin something. I'm forgetting her name. Matilda's played by a woman named Caitlin, who's also on the spectrum. Like, they're all autistic actresses, and what was so amazing to me was when I discovered Everything Was Gonna Be Okay, I was so excited. I was like, you mean they're actually going to have an authentic autistic actors playing these characters? And all of Matilda's friends were actually authentically autistic actors and actresses, and it was amazing. And I'm sitting there going, wow, this is great. Because at the same time that I was discovering Everything's Gonna Be Okay, Atypical was taking off. And Atypical started out okay. Like, I kind of liked it. And I was kind of hooked. And then something happened with it that left a very sour taste in my mouth. And I was first off, I was very angry, I think, about the story. I just was. I don't know how to explain it. I was very angry about this, first off, they cast, yet again, another neurotypical actor in the role of Sam Gardner. And I know so many neurodivergent males who could have been in that role and done it well and handled the material well. And I'm not faulting some of the authentically autistic actors and actresses who were a part of later seasons. But I do just kind of fault, and I also want to say that, like later seasons of Everything's Gonna Be Okay, I want to say that Atypical ended up being backed by Autism Speaks at some point, and that angered me a little bit. So, so those were two shows that were on at the time. But when I discovered everything was going to be okay before it all kind of went south, at least according to reviews, I can't speak to it personally. I kind of fell off the show. But I wouldn't be opposed to trying to finish the first season if I ever got the chance. But everything's gonna be okay to me was amazing. It was great. It was wonderful. I was so happy that there was an authentically autistic actress, playing an authentically autistic individual. And she was quirky and she was fun and she had autonomy, and Matilda was great. I related to Matilda. I loved that character. And then about that same time I was discovering She-Ra. And I was discovering She-Ra and the Princesses of Power through a negative light. And I think I finally said to myself one day, you know what? I'll watch it for myself. And if it's as bad as some of the reviewers are saying it is, then I'll put it down. But I decided to kind of go in without expectation. And I was so happy when I learned that Princess Entrapta from She-Ra was autistic. And I was like, well, as far as I know, her actress isn't neurodivergent, but there was an authentically autistic consultant on the team. So in that case, it still wasn't authentically being played by, so you had two shows. It might not have been authentically played by somebody. As far as I know, I don't know much about Entrapta's actress, so I don't want to misspeak. As far as I know, my personal knowledge is limited there. But the character was said to be autistic, and that was really cool. I related to Entrapta. I loved her right away. So that was 2 for 2 for me. I was like, wow, Entrapta's autistic, Matilda's autistic. There's a whole host of autistic characters on this screen. I'm like, yeah, that's so awesome. And and I was a little turned off though by Atypical. And roll 2020, nothing, 2020, the dark ages. I was so inspired by the recent amazing, in my opinion at the time, authentic representation that was happening, that I crafted my own. And because I was sitting there and I was learning so much about neurodiversity and what it meant to be neurodivergent and what that really was, and I was discovering my own, I think, identity and as someone who is autistic. And I, through 2018 to late 2019 and even into the dark ages of 2020, I, during amazingly, in a month, it'll be the 4-year anniversary of Chaotic Idiots, the series. And I created the characters of Jacob, Adar, and Edgar. And I authentically created them to be autistic, based upon my own experiences with friends on the spectrum and my own experiences. Jacob is very much a part of that. And while the mainstream media and the world of the mainstream, world may never know of the character yet, because success is not given, it is earned. And I'll keep working till I get there. But Jacob is important to me because it's the first time that I kind of put my foot down, and I remember seeing so much talk online about people going, we want authentic representation, we want authentic representation, we want over and over and over and over again. And I promise you, people, this all ties into what I'm getting to. And so for a time, I felt as if I was the only person, because I remember the world of audio dramas was being revitalized because that was the only form of entertainment that actors and stuff could do. And so you had this big boom in audio dramas and audio drama productions and stories being told in a different medium, and I kind of jumped on that bandwagon during the cusp of its inception in late 2020, and with of course the Chaotic Idiots podcast. So plug for that, because I have authentic neurodivergent individuals. My entire cast is neurodivergent. They all have they all deal with a disability or a difficulty in some way, and and they authentically portrayed incredible characters, and that matters to me. But the point being that I finally put my foot down and said, I am so tired of people talking about wanting authentic representation. You have a platform. Why don't you just do it yourself? And I remember one day I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it. Somebody finally has to put the money where their mouth is and do it and make it happen. And let me tell you, I was terrified that nobody would want to join me, because I had somebody tell me that I shouldn't be making my characters neurodivergent in any capacity, because nobody wanted that. Nobody did it right, nobody would ever do it right, and why would I believe that I could do it right? Because nobody wants that. And I was terrified that nobody would want to join me on this journey. Come to find out that that's total bull hockey. And many people joined me. As a matter of fact, 34 people joined me. And we created 2 amazing seasons, both led by neurodivergent voices. So I must be doing something right. And that person was a liar and bitter, and I don't like them. But at that time, it felt like after everything's going to be okay ended, and Atypical ended, as much as Atypical I feel like did more damage than it did anything else. When those shows ended, and they did end, I was like, man, there's nothing, is there? There's nothing else. There's no more plans. We were at such a peak, and now all of a sudden, there's nothing. And and at the time, I didn't know that Heartbreak High would be a thing. I didn't know about the book called, A Kind of Spark was either being, I have to do more research on this, but I didn't know that certain media would come about, which leads me into the main portion of this episode, which is, thank you for bearing with me, listeners, on this long tangent of stuff, but the main portion of today's episode is going to be talking about 2 pieces of incredible autistic-led media that are not getting enough attention, and they need more attention, because what I've seen of them floored me and had me both laughing and crying and smiling and and feeling so seen and represented in more ways than I have ever been or ever felt I was in all the years that I have consumed media and sought out media that represented me in a way that, or me and everybody else, in a way that wasn't offensive or stereotypical, hurtful, derogatory, or treated me like a non-autonomous object. And I'm looking at you, the movie we call music. That's an offensive movie. And for reasons that I'll let you look up on your own. But the most amazing pieces of media that I have seen in the last year and a half are two incredible books. One of which and I will implore you, please, the recording may not be the best because I didn't have this at the time. But I'll tell you what was amazing. I got to speak to the incredible Jessica Scott White about her book back in 2021, The Asparagus Bunch, which I highly recommend that more people go and buy the audiobook. Especially you buy that audiobook because I know the person who read the audiobook. His name is Jack Morby, and I'm going to sing his praises. He did phenomenal. I have heard samples of that audiobook. He is a phenomenal actor. And more people deserve to buy that audiobook and listen to the phenomenal work that he did, because he deserves all the success equally as much as Jessica. Miss Jessica deserves all the success. So listen to the episode where I get to interview both her and Jack about the Asparagus Bunch book during its launch, and I would highly recommend that you go and you purchase both the audiobook and the physical book. It is currently only in the UK, so you have to order it from Amazon, but I hope to heavens that story gets sold in stores over here in the States, because I've read a 10-chapter preview of it, and I highly recommend that you do too, because it is amazing. And I got to speak to her graciously. She graciously gifted me her time, and that is an experience that I'll never forget. And it is because Jack did such a phenomenal job, on her audiobook. And I'm grateful to him too, for that chance. So, what we're going to be talking about today in the main portion of this episode is modern, authentic, autistic representation and why it matters. And I'm going to be speaking on A Kind of Spark by Ellie McNoll and The Asparagus Bunch by Jessica Scott White. So, without further ado, let's dive in to the main portion of today's episode. So, let's talk modern representation, and let's use the example of A Kind of Spark and the book, The Asparagus Bunch. First off, they are two incredible stories by two amazing authors, and I'm so excited to be able to to witness, both these tales and both these stories being welcomed and accepted, and it's fun to witness authentic autistic media that, at least for the majority of what I've seen, has been positive responses. I'm sure somebody somewhere will have something negative to say, as much as it would be amazing if this world was just full of positive people who were encouraging and accepting and loving. Oftentimes there are people who just aren't, and it doesn't matter, what you do or what you try to do, and you could try to be the kindest, most helpful person in the world, just trying to do a bit of good for an area in which you see things are lacking, and you could still not be seen in a good light, and the things that you do could also not be seen in a good light, and that's important to remember. But as far as I've seen, the response to both the Asparagus Bunch and to A Kind of Spark are amazing. And it's inspiring for somebody like me who is trying to create her own series, who has been trying to create her own series for the last 4 years with authentically autistic characters in the lead, who are important and who matter, and whose people who are voicing them matter too. Because it was important to me that I voiced Jacob. It was important to me that I finally took the pen and wrote down what it was like for me to sort of discover my own authentically autistic identity, an identity which I had always had, but didn't really know that was within me. And so why does it matter that the Asparagus Bunch and A Kind of Spark and even Heartbreak High, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I've heard that people really love Quinny, and I have to sit down and maybe that'll be my next watch is Heartbreak High. Why it matters that these characters exist. Why it matters that the things that we, how do I put this? I was listening to an amazing hard of hearing creator who wrote a show called Seen and Not Heard, and I'm so excited to listen to this because I think it's unique, and it's unlike any of the other, I'm very particular when it comes to the fiction podcasts, the audio dramas that I listen to. I have a very particular sort of niche. I really love those stories that you can kind of listen to in the quiet of the evening, and sometimes they're high stakes, and sometimes they're really, I don't know how to describe them, but I like those kinds of those shows that you can listen to, and they have a calm vibe to them. The reason why I bring this up is because I was listening to this creator talk about what it was like to bring a character who is deaf and hard of hearing to the audio drama world, and how crafting that representation was really sort of based around her own journey and trying to express herself and her feelings. And I feel the same way about what I've been trying to do and why I feel like it's been so hard. As I mentioned in the previous segment, back when when I was really discovering a lot of beautiful, authentic, autistic media, that opened, I think, even the doors for what I do as a creator, I didn't know that Asparagus Bunch would be a thing. And I didn't know that a kind of spark would also become a thing. And and maybe a kind of spark was around longer than I realized. And I know Elliot McNoll has many amazing books with neurodivergent kids as the lead even in one of her stories. It's called Show Us Who You Are. She has an autistic and ADHD friendship, which is amazing. That there's so little representation, I feel, proper representation for those with ADHD. Very much like how in the Asparagus Bunch, Miss Jessica Scott White wrote a character who has dyslexia. And there are many disabilities out there. It's not just autism that requires representation. And it's amazing, just sort of discovering all these different things that I had no idea existed or have come into existence and keep coming into existence, and this amazing rise in representation, because there are those who have much more of a reach than sometimes smaller creators ever will. And when you have other people out there who have more connections and more ways to sort of open doors, that allows the smaller creators who feel equally as strongly as the ones who are leading the charge. We are standing behind them going, this is amazing, what you've created is beautiful. Thank you for characters like Addie and characters like Keaty and characters like Matilda and her sister and her friends. And thank you for characters like Leon and all of Leon's friends. And thank you for all the characters that Miss Elliot McNoll has created, because not only are you trying to represent autism, but you're trying to represent other facets of the disability community, including dyslexia and ADHD and all these amazing people, who I've been surrounded by probably all my life, and I just didn't know it because we all fell into the spectrum of having an invisible disability, and we were all surrounded by people who didn't like us, who were just mean to us, and we didn't know what else to do. We didn't know what else to say other than, I guess, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I don't know why, I just thought that this is how people are. And you sit there and, there's really nothing on television that can help to maybe explain what you can't explain in words. And so watching the love and the acceptance of a kind of spark, and watching the love and the acceptance of the Asparagus Bunch. But the bottom line is why authentic autistic representation in all forms of disabled representation matters is because finally somebody else out there heard what we were trying to say all along. And they heard those many young voices out there cry out, we want representation. We want to feel seen. We want to explain what we can't explain. That's what it was for me. That's what it is for me with the characters of Jacob and Edgar and Adar. That's what it is for me watching a kind of spark with Addie and Keaty and reading the Asparagus Bunch. What it is almost like stepping back into the shoes of a much younger me and sitting down with that version of me and going, one day you're going to see yourself in characters represented in both books and television. And they won't be the things that you saw before and went, but I don't act like that. That's not me. I'm excited to dive more into the Asparagus Bunch, and I'm excited to dive into the world of a kind of spark, and even more of Ellie McNoll's, fantastical stories. And any other writer who comes, who comes along after them because they were inspired by people who finally said, enough is enough. We're done with your lackluster representation. It's not been done right. We're done. We're finally going to do it right, and we're going to push for, authentic actors and authentic actresses and authentic writers and authentic cast and crew. We're going to, and as Addie's little speech at the end of A Kind of Spark goes, I'm autistic, and I can't be cured, and I don't want to be. It makes things difficult, but it's just part of me. And we need all kinds of differences in the world. I can't express or explain what watching this show and how witnessing and reading the Asparagus Bunch and getting to witness this incredible rise again in authentic representation. I can't tell you. I probably should mention that another thing that made me cry happy tears, of course, before I know that there's a little bit of controversy with Sesame Street and the puppet character of Julia, as Autism Speaks got involved, and that wasn't a good move. A lot of people were very upset about that, but even just the fact that Julia, a character like Julia, is a part of a children's program that I grew up on, that made me so happy. You finally, Sesame Street's always been diverse. And so having it to introduce to children and to explain to the next generation is amazing to me. How amazing is that? Not only do you have a rise in middle grade age autistic protagonists, you finally have them in a program that's not offensive. It's amazing. It's amazing some of the strides that have been taken. And they're only small strides. Everything's going to be okay. Heartbreak High with Quinny. You know, they're just small steps. The Asparagus Punch, A Kind of Spark, Addie, Leon, Matilda. That entire family. It's amazing to me as someone who's trying to do the same, to champion neurodivergent inclusion, and has been for a long time. You know, it's incredible to see the strides that are being made in television too, and the inclusivity there, and just it's just amazing to me. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because, you know, for so long I remember reading all these different neurodivergent headcanons and people looking to characters who seemed more authentically autistic than the characters that we were supposed to feel represented by. And when we didn't feel represented by these characters, you know, people pointed fingers and went, you can never be happy. You can never be happy with the things that are written for you. And we kind of sat there and went, yeah, we're not happy because you aren't representing me. You're representing what you think I am, not what I am. And so to finally have characters like Addie and characters like Leon, and characters who aren't even written yet, who I hope keep getting written and keep filling the shelves with what we've needed for a long time, which is characters that we're not asking anybody to represent every single story. It's physically impossible. But represent us in a way that is at least authentically true. And I can say with all my heart that I would really encourage everybody to go and purchase A Kind of Spark. Go and watch the show. Purchase the Asparagus Bunch. Go watch Heartbreak High. Maybe if it's not selfish, go ahead and please, if you could, listen to Chaotic Idiots, the series. It's not a perfect show, but it has a neurodivergent cast. Equally as much as any of the amazing things out there that I've mentioned, such as Everything's Gonna Be Okay. And all the incredible shows and the books and the things that I've mentioned. Just go and get them. Read them. I hope you see yourself in them in some way. Even if it's not fully and wholly your story. I hope you at least feel more authentically represented than you ever have been. Because I know that when I sat down to read and to watch these things, the biggest smile crossed my face. That's what acceptance feels like. That it's okay. It's okay that you're not like everybody else. It's okay that you have the reactions that you do. It's okay that you were built a little bit differently. No one has the right to take that away from you, and no one has the right to tell you that it's wrong. These shows and these stories are a gateway for those of us who are neurodivergent and don't fit into your neurotypical world to finally say, I matter. I'm autistic. I can't be cured. And I don't want to be. I don't want to be. It matters. Because we need all kinds of differences in this world. Differences aren't bad. Different isn't wrong. You know, when I was little, I used to not like the word different. Because different meant bad. Different meant something was wrong. Different was derogatory in my book because of how it had been used to describe me. Well, I'm here to say that I relinquish that. I'm going to start shifting the narrative. Because I am different. But being different isn't a bad thing. And I like who I am. I like who I am. And I appreciate that these stories also tell me that it's okay to be who I am. And what's not okay is intolerance. And what's not okay is ableism and bullying and rudeness and unkind people and people who take those of us who are neurodivergent for granted, who treat us like we've done something wrong by taking a different path to do the same thing. We'll never fit into your perfect box. But I think that's okay. A kind of spark in the asparagus bunch, and everything's going to be okay. And even, Shira, every piece of media out there that is fighting and championing and is a champion for those of us who fall into the spectrum, we'll raise our voices higher. And that is the most important thing. So, I'm going to leave you with a question. How has this modern neurodivergent movement hopefully represented you? Do you feel as if you have to continue to write, your story? Or I guess a better way to phrase that is, do you feel the need to pick up the pen and join the millions and millions and millions of voices that now have a voice? Because there are amazing leading players at the forefront. How does it make you feel? For me, it makes me feel amazing and empowered and seen and accepted and not afraid to be myself anymore. Don't be afraid to be yourself, because who you are matters, even if nobody else ever understands. Thank you for listening. My name is Faith Jacobs, and I am signing off.